The gun barrel is glowing red hot, and Sergeant John Basilone is changing it with his bare hands. There's no time to wait for it to cool. It's the night of October 24th, 1942, on a jungle ridge above Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, and roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers are throwing themselves at a thin line of American Marines in waves that don't stop coming. One of Basilone's 2 machine gun sections has already been overrun, the crew dead or dying, only 2 men left able to fight. He is about to become, for the next several hours, very close to the entire defense of this stretch of line by himself. To understand how a machine gunner ends up holding a battle almost alone, you have to understand the man well before that ridge and the nickname that followed him into it. John Basilone was born in 1916 in Buffalo, New York, and raised in Raritan, New Jersey, one of 10 children in an Italian-American family that never had much money to spare. He enlisted in the Army in 1934, straight out of his teenage years, and was posted to the Philippines, a deployment that earned him a nickname his fellow Marines would use for the rest of his life, long after he'd left the Army entirely and enlisted in the Marine Corps instead. They called him Manila John. By the time the Pacific War found him again in 1942, he was a machine gun section leader, and by September he had landed on Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division, part of the desperate early effort to hold a single airstrip that both sides understood could decide the entire Solomon Islands campaign. That airstrip was Henderson Field, and by late October, Japan had decided to end the argument over who controlled it. Roughly 3,000 Japanese troops were committed to a coordinated night assault, meant to break the American perimeter in one push, overwhelming a defensive line that, in Basilone's sector, depended on a relatively small number of heavy machine guns to hold an enormous amount of jungle. The attack came at night, the way the most dangerous ones on Guadalcanal usually did. Muzzle flashes the only real light, screaming and mortar fire, the only reliable warning of where the next wave was breaking through the tree line. Basilone was in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns positioned to cover a critical stretch of the line. One section took the worst of it almost immediately. Grenades and mortar rounds found the gun pits directly, killing crew after crew until only 2 Marines in that section were still able to fight. In most defensive lines, that's the moment a position collapses and the enemy pours through the gap. Basilone didn't let it collapse. He physically moved an additional gun into the failing position himself, hauling it under continuous fire to plug the hole the enemy was already trying to exploit. Then, working almost entirely by feel in the darkness, he repaired a second gun that had jammed, a task that under calm daylight conditions took trained hands several careful minutes, and that he was now doing while explosions walked closer with every passing second. He got it firing again, and then he manned it personally, holding that section of line essentially by himself until reinforcements could reach him. Private Nash Phillips, who fought alongside him that night, would later describe watching Basilone move between positions as though the darkness and the incoming fire simply didn't register the way they registered for everyone else. Not recklessness, but a strange, focused calm that steadied the men fighting beside him, even as the line kept threatening to break. The fighting didn't let up enough for the guns to simply keep firing on their own. Barrels overheated fast under sustained combat use, and a machine gun with an overheated barrel doesn't just perform worse, it becomes genuinely dangerous, prone to cooking off rounds or seizing entirely at the exact moment a gunner needs it most. Basilone changed barrels in almost total darkness, repeatedly, without the luxury of gloves thick enough to fully protect his hands from metal that had spent the last several minutes being fired continuously into advancing enemy soldiers. Marines nearby would later describe him moving constantly along the position, checking guns, clearing stoppages, physically repositioning weapons to cover whatever gap had opened next, all while somehow keeping his own gun in the fight at the same time. At one point during the night, ammunition simply ran out at the position, with no resupply convoy managing to reach him through the chaos. Basilone made the decision himself. He left the relative cover of his position and ran alone through jungle actively full of enemy fire to link up with whatever ammunition he could find and bring it back. It was the kind of decision that gets men killed constantly in combat, leaving a defensible position, moving through open, contested ground. For a supply run, any reasonable calculation would call somebody else's job. He made it back. The guns kept firing because he'd made that run. By the time daylight finally broke, and the Japanese assault broke apart against the line that had somehow held through the entire night, Basilone was one of only 3 Marines from his original section still alive. The rest, men he had fought beside for months, men whose guns he had repaired and whose positions he had reinforced under fire, were dead or too badly wounded to have kept fighting. The line held. Henderson Field stayed in American hands, and a Marine Corps colonel named Louis Chesty Puller, who would go on to become one of the most decorated Marines in the Corps' entire history, personally recommended Basilone for the Medal of Honor after seeing what he'd done that night. He became the first enlisted Marine of the entire Second World War to receive it. When the medal was presented to him in 1943, Basilone gave the credit away almost immediately, in a line that followed him for the rest of his life. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal," a quiet acknowledgement that the men who hadn't survived that ridge had paid for the same medal now hanging around his own neck. What followed should have been the safe part of his war, the Marine Corps understanding exactly what kind of publicity a genuine, humble, decorated hero could generate for a war bond campaign, pulled Basilone off the front lines and sent him home to a nationwide tour, parades, newsreels, a famous face on recruiting posters, the full machinery of wartime celebrity built around a machine gunner from New Jersey who had never asked for any of it. He was assigned to train new machine gunners at Camp Pendleton in California, a respected, safe, entirely reasonable posting for a man who had already given the war more than most soldiers ever would. Basilone hated it. He submitted request after request to be released from the tour and sent back to a combat unit, and the Marine Corps turned him down repeatedly. His value as a symbol, alive and touring stateside, was considered too high to risk losing him back to the front. He kept asking anyway. In 1944, while still training Marines at Camp Pendleton, he met and married Lena Riggi, herself a Marine serving in the Women's Reserve, one of the only genuinely peaceful chapters in an adult life that had, up to that point, been almost entirely defined by combat and its aftermath. Eventually, near the end of 1944, the Marine Corps relented. Basilone was assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division, and shipped back to the Pacific, back into exactly the kind of fighting he'd spent over a year trying to return to. On the 19th of February, 1945, the first day of the invasion of Iwo Jima, Basilone landed on Red Beach 2 as a machine gun section leader once again. The Japanese defenses on that beach were some of the most heavily fortified positions American troops would face in the entire war. Bunkers and blockhouses built with overlapping fields of fire, specifically designed to pin an invading force in the open sand and grind it down. Basilone's unit found itself stopped cold by one of those blockhouses, unable to advance, taking casualties with no clear way through. He didn't wait for it to be somebody else's problem. Basilone made his way, alone, directly on top of the blockhouse itself, and using grenades and demolition charges, destroyed the position and the Japanese unit, defending it from the inside out, clearing by himself the exact kind of obstacle that had a habit of stopping entire companies on that beach that morning. With the advance moving again toward the airfield beyond, Basilone then found a Marine tank trapped in a minefield, stuck under concentrated Japanese mortar and artillery fire, with no way to move safely in any direction. He guided it out personally, on foot, exposed the entire time to the same barrage threatening the tank crew inside. Moments after that, moving along the edge of the airfield he had just helped clear a path toward, Basilone was killed by Japanese mortar shrapnel. He was 28 years old, and the beach he died crossing was still, at that moment, littered with the wreckage of the exact kind of fighting he had spent months in California trying desperately to get back to. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for what he'd done on Iwo Jima, making him the only enlisted Marine of the entire Second World War to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Two of the highest awards the United States military can give, earned on two different islands 3 years apart by a man who had spent the time in between trying as hard as he could to get back to exactly the kind of fighting that eventually killed him. This is John Basilone, the machine gunner who held a battle alone at Guadalcanal, gave the credit to the men who didn't survive it, and then spent the rest of his short life trying to go back and stand beside them again.